Chapter 6 of Marx's Capital is the sale and purchase of labor power. So we still need to figure out where surplus value comes from. Marx showed us in Chapter 5 that it doesn't originate in the process of commodity circulation. If everyone's exchanging commodities around, individuals might have more use values, but the total social wealth remains the same. Valorization must occur somewhere else. First, he looks at money and notes that money itself cannot just grow in value, assuming the prices of commodities stay the same. So surplus value must originate somehow in the commodity. Remember, you have this circuit M, C, M prime, and we just ruled out the M. Marx writes, in order to be able to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags must be so lucky so as to find a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. Now, can you think of a commodity that produces value? If you said labor power, you are correct. You've been paying attention. Good. Remember, in Chapter 1, Section 1 and 2, we note that labor is the source of value, and that services are commodities, and labor power is therefore a commodity. In order for one to produce labor power as a commodity, there must be other people willing to sell their labor power. For that to happen, you must have people who are freely able to do so. The buyer of labor power and the seller of labor power must be able to confront each other in the market as legally equal. And the sale of labor power should be for a limited period of time, otherwise people will be selling themselves into slavery. So for this to work, there needs to be a level of equality under the law. In this sense, capitalism has a progressive element to it over the feudal system that capitalism replaced. Those who sell the labor power do so for a temporary amount of time, so that the seller continues to have control over it and knows what to expect for its exchange. Another essential condition for this is that the person selling their labor must sell the commodities that they make with the labor power for the time their labor power is being purchased. The buyer of labor power pays for the abstract labor and in exchange gets concrete labor. But now, of course, the person selling the labor doesn't actually have the means of production needed to produce those commodities, otherwise they would probably be able to just do it themselves. What happens is that the person buying the labor power allows the laborer access to the means of production, either raw materials or tools, and we'll get into that later. The buyer of labor power, the capitalist, doesn't know or care why there is this free laborer selling their labor power on the market. Doesn't matter to him. It just is the case from the capitalist's perspective. But we care, and we have to understand that this is the result of a historical process. Things become commodities when they are produced for the use of others. Otherwise, there would be no reason for exchange. Nobody would want them if they're not useful. People working for their own subsistence is generally the norm. Selling your labor power only happens in the capitalist mode of production. So one might wonder what historically occurred to produce a population of individuals who are going around trying to sell their labor power to others. Marx doesn't deal with the historical development of capitalism here, but he does do so in Part 8 of Volume 1, where he talks about primitive accumulation. Now, naturally, the capitalist must pay the worker enough, as Marx calls it, for his maintenance and reproduction. If the worker isn't being paid enough to eat or take care of themselves, they will die. Dead workers are less productive, so the capitalist has an incentive to pay at least some minimum. And workers have an incentive to sell their labor for at least enough to continue not being dead. The capitalist must also pay for the raw materials being used, as well as any special education or training that is required. If you recall the distinction between abstract and concrete labor from Chapter 1, Section 2, When we talk about labor power, we're talking about the mental and physical capability for people to do work and produce use values. The exchange value of the labor power is known in advance. Say I pay you $10 for an hour of labor. But the use value of that labor, quote, consists in the subsequent exercise of that labor power, unquote. The worker gets paid wages at the end of the contracted period, and in the meantime, the worker is a creditor to the capitalist. This is a key point where surplus value arises. The mismatch between the exchange value of the abstract labor and the concrete objectified labor. So we see throughout all of this that the origin of surplus value lies not in the sphere of circulation, but in the sphere of production. The capitalist hires a worker, paying them for the labor power. The worker does work for the capitalist, producing a commodity. Because labor power produces value, the capitalist, having possession of the things that the labor power produced, makes a profit because he owns the commodities produced by the worker. I want to take a step back and look at everything we covered so far briefly. Marx started out with a commodity, something that is produced for exchange, and we looked at how a money commodity arises out of bartering as a universal exchange commodity, and how this money commodity gets replaced by an abstract representation of value. And once you have commodity exchange with money, some people will begin to hire labor. All of these steps were historically necessary or logical advances. Each step naturally produced the step after it. Each step was a rational development in the road to the capitalist mode of production. Capitalism is a rational system in that not only did the capitalist mode of production result or develop as a result of rational developments in economics, but people acting within the capitalist mode of production are acting rationally, to an extent at least, within the capitalist framework. It's rational for the capitalist to hire labor to make profits. It's rational for the laborer to sell their labor. The capitalist doesn't amass a great fortune at the expense of the worker because the capitalist is mean-spirited, which, well, they might be, but they're doing it because it's in their own perceived interest. This brings part 2 to an end. In part 3, Marx will talk about capitalism itself, the capitalist mode of production, and the production of what he calls absolute surplus value.